And welcome everybody, those who are present and those who will watch the recorded version to the so our fourth of 9 webinars. Um, so if in the last webinar we started our work on the phase two, so basically the structuring of the problem that we want to solve, or put another way, building the roadmap for how to tackle the problem that we want to solve. What we learned last time was essentially what we mean by a roadmap. So it was kind of the what, like what are we aiming for with these roadmaps? The focus today will be to share techniques with you on how to build these roadmaps, right? So that's a little bit the idea. Um, so let me jump straight to the agenda for today. As always, I'm going to do a quick recap of where we are so far in terms of progressing through our projects and progressing through the methodology. I'm going to give feedback on the 2 question trees that were submitted. And then we will proceed with the how bit, so the various techniques to build roadmaps, the kinds of roadmaps that we already described in the last webinar. And then we'll wrap it up, of course. And then in the appendix, just so that you know, there are 2 things. There are real-life examples of question trees. These examples actually come from predecessors of yours. So they're examples that I've selected because I think they're good in many ways. All of them could use some form of improvement, so they're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I think they're all good in many ways. So there's about a dozen examples or so. And this way, the idea is that you're not just limited to the examples that I show you about, help desk and so on and so forth, that you just have a wider variety of things that also just feel a bit more, yeah, just broader than just like profit type stuff, right? And then the second thing is the drivers of behavior. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now, but I think once we've gone through today's session, the notion of drivers of behavior will make more sense, and maybe I will remember to explain a little bit more what that means. All right. So anyway, that's the agenda for today. So let me start with the recap. So again, I start at the end. This is where we want to end up, right? Now we've worked on the right problem, that we've communicated the solution really well. Of course, that they agree with it, which means that we problem solved through this issue in the right way. We did the right research, the right analytics. We extracted the right so what's from all of that. And that's we actually provided a clear pathway to implementation. So best chance to reach this point, the SPS methodology, which we're working through. Remember to that is something that needs to be applied step by step. So we don't want to skip steps, although it's totally fine to come back to steps if we have some insight that suggests we should reiterate a certain step. We want to proactively involve our stakeholders in every step along the way. Because they have a lot of valuable input to provide. We're still in the driver's seat. We still drive the process. We manage the process. We own the process, but they probably have a lot of really valuable content. Yeah. And finally, remember, we want to overinvest in the early stages, basically because just like a house, right? If you start building the house with the wrong design, you're going to end up having to do a lot of rework because you're going to realize, oh no, oh my God, no, we did not want a bedroom in that, in that location, or we wanted the bedroom to have different, I don't know, size or something. So ideally, we really want to avoid all these problems by getting the design right up front. And so it's the same thing here. We want to make sure that we have the project definition robust, so we really know what it is that we want to deliver. And we have the roadmap really robust, which is we have a really clear plan about how to get there. So project definition, speaking of which, this is it. So at the center is a question, one question, specific question about what to do. There's a context given by the situation complication that helps us or brings the light to this question in terms of like why this question matters, why it needs to be solved, and why it needs to be solved now for this company. And then all around the answer, the scope, the objectives, and success criteria, and the deliverables are all these different aspects that describe the solution, aspects of the solution, so as to give us more visibility about what it is that we want to aim for, right? So that's that. Now, once we are, and we really want this to be like, we want to be 100% aligned. We want to avoid vagueness in this. We want everything to be very specific, and we want to be able to shake hands with our sponsor on this. So once we're fully aligned with our sponsor on what it is that we need to deliver, what we're committing to deliver, this is a bit our contract, if you will, with the sponsor, then it's about building a plan to get there. And so we started talking last time about what do we mean by a plan? And essentially, we talked about building an analytical question tree. So in other words, a breakdown of the question into more granular questions that meet a certain set of conditions. Probably the first and most valuable condition is this solution focus. So in other words, we want sub-questions that are such that if we answer them, if we get good answers to them, it actually gives us a partial answer to the bigger question we're trying to solve. Because in this way, it's extremely efficient, instead of simply questions that just produce data, and we don't know if this data will help. Second condition, that it be MECE, so in other words, cleanly organized without conceptual mix-ups, so that when we work on one part of the problem, we know that we're not working on the other, and we don't make things confusing for ourselves and for our audiences. And then, of course, it should fit with the context, because that's the way to ensure that in the end, it makes business sense to look at the problem this way. So were there any questions about, I mean, that's essentially where we got to. Were there any questions about this? Before I give the feedback on the two question trees that were submitted, I'm just curious if there were any questions about the content that we've covered so far.
I think we're good.
Yeah? Okay. Then maybe one little reminder, because this will come in handy as we go through the content today. We did introduce the notion of a dimension. So when we break in the context of MECE, when we're trying to avoid overlaps, what we want to do is when we break down a concept, a question, we want to use a single dimension to break it down and not multiple dimensions. Because when we use multiple dimensions, then this is what creates overlaps and confusion. And for the various techniques that I'm going to share with you, this really matters to just kind of stick to one dimension as we do a breakdown. But okay, we'll get to this. Okay, so feedback. So here's how I propose to, we have two trees. I propose the following. So first, my feedback is going to be basically, first, do I understand them? Does the flow and the logic make sense? And then I'm just going to be checking, like, and I'm going to be doing this for the SCQ and the question tree. And then for the question tree, I'm just checking also, like, does it meet the three conditions, right, that make a great question tree? Of course, whether you were one of the submitters or you have your own question tree, you should continue to refine them by working with your sponsor, but also seeking feedback from your peers. Now, in terms of the process right now, my suggestion is first read the question. If the question is not 100% clear to you or you want some more context, scan or read the situation and complication. Then read the whole level one, and then maybe scan level two. And when you're done, then let me know on the chat box, and then I will start providing my feedback. So here's the first one. Thank you, Uli. I will go ahead and provide the feedback then. So I'm going to start with the question. I think the question is excellent in its own right. Yeah, the question is very specific. It's very actionable. I think I don't think anybody could understand it in a different way. So I think the question is very good, like as a from a technical perspective. Yeah. Um, the situation complication, I think, is a little bit chaotic. I think you could probably use a bit better structure. I mean, overall, I get it, right? The big picture, we get it, which is that like, yeah, Samsung has great like recognition, brand presence and recognition with like the older generations, but like once we start to get to Gen Z, it's like it plummets, and that's not good. So that we get it. But overall, the way it's written, the order in which things are presented, etc., it's a little bit chaotic. So I think that could be cleaned up a bit. Um, Now, as far as the question tree itself is concerned, the questions in the question tree, first of all, they are questions, which is great, and they're actually solution focused, which is also great. So in other words, answering these questions would go some way towards solving the original problem. So I think that's great. I also think that I don't really see any overlaps, which is good, but I see a lot of gaps. I see a lot of gaps, and probably more, even more fundamentally, I think it's like it's a little bit too vague, and it's not sort of what's missing is a little bit like an angle of attack. So I mean, there's a number of ways to sort of like approach this. I mean, one, you could just make it purely like you could say like, hey, it's a branding problem. So, and then maybe the question could be slightly readjusted, but just basically solve it through just the branding angle, right? Or no, or you say like, hey, maybe it's a marketing mix question. So the four P's type of thinking or seven P's type of thinking. So it could be something like that, or you could look at it more like a demand and supply problem. So are we doing all the right things on the demand side to basically stimulate, desire for these phones, for lack of better wording? But are we also doing all the right things on the supply side to make sure that like the right phones are available in the right place at the right time, kind of thing? You could look at it from sort of like the classics from marketing funnel perspective. So awareness, all the way to so the whatever the awareness. I don't remember it from the top of my head, but like awareness, um, activation, consideration. that kind of funnel. So basically, it's kind of like the sort of steps that somebody goes in their minds to between sort of not even having thought about buying this thing all the way to having made the purchase. That could be another. But so right now, and so by taking an approach like that, you help ensure that like you um, ensure you reduce the chance of having significant gaps. But I think right now there's just a lot of gaps um, in the current breakdown. That's pretty much what I have. I don't know if any of the live participants has some observations on this tree. Yet. Okay, then um, let's move on to the next one. So same process, read the question first, maybe scan the situation complication, read level one, and then scan level two. And let me know when you're done. Here it is. It's a lot. I would even say you can skip level two altogether. Good. Shall I? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, great. Um, okay, so let me start with a question. I think the question, just like the question we saw before, is crystal clear, so that's very good. There's one little change I would make to the question is more in the formulation, but instead of asking what is the optimal approach, which does not include the subject, so this is the passive, essentially it's a passive voice. I would reframe it as how can week one, i.e. the company, best achieve best achieve, right? So this way we make week one the an explicit protagonist in this, and it actually shortens the question. So you get two benefits all in one. But otherwise, the question is very good. Now, in the SCQ, in fact, there's a whole history behind this project that I'm familiar with, and this history helps to explain some of the issues that I'm going to mention now. But I think they should be addressed. So I'll give the very big picture right now, and then I'll go into the detail. But right now, there's a mismatch between the situation complication and the question. There's also a mismatch between the question and some of the buckets in the tree. And there's a match between some of the buckets in the tree and the situation complication. But that match is where it mismatches with the question. So we have some basically parts of this that are talking to each other, but not talking to the rest. And this is where that's essentially what needs to be fixed. So let me get into the detail. So starting with the mismatch between the situation and the complication. So the complication goes a lot into essentially what is different about and what is kind of special about the business environment in KSA versus Germany, right? I mean, the comparison with Germany is implicit, but that's what it does. And but the thing is, there is nothing about and so essentially what the complication is saying, and this is a little bit what I remember from previous discussions, but essentially it's kind of like, yeah, applying the existing business model of week one that's being applied in Germany into KSA is really difficult because the KSA environment is different, so adaptations are necessary. This is kind of like all partially explicit, partially implicit. But there's nothing about that says that we need to get to 100K by Q2 2026. There's no link between the challenges of doing business in KSA with this target that we need to achieve of 100K, within this time frame. So there's a disconnect there. And in fact, I would even argue the situation complication don't give me any insight about the significance of 100K or Q2 2026. What is 100K? Is it like the minimum amount to believe that we can do business here in the long term? Is it actually minimum viable scale? Like, what is the 100K? And what is Q2 2026? Is that like quick? So is the idea of 100K by Q2 26, is this a notion of speed, and why does speed matter? I don't know. I'm speculating, but because the situation complication gives me nothing on this front. So that's the mismatch. Now, if I go into the question tree, I think buckets 1 and 3 are very relevant to the question. So which segments to target and which channels and partnerships to basically acquire customers from these segments. Great. But buckets 2 and 4, they don't connect to the question. They connect to the context, but not to the question. So the right bucket 2 is adjustments to the business model. Yeah. So it connects to the context. But I'm not sure that you need to solve I don't think you need to solve the adjustments to the business model in order to solve the go-to-market approach. You'll eventually, when you start to execute the go-to-market approach, you'll have to know what that adjustments to the business model is. But if you just stick to the question as it is right now, it's not requiring a solving of the business model problem. And then the fourth one, the success metrics that will validate and de-risk the KSA expansion, I mean, that is, again, I'm sure it's useful to know, but we don't need to solve this in order to solve the GTM question. So again, there's a disconnect. It connects to the complication, but not to the question. So you see, we have these different mappings in this partial PDT, but the mappings are incomplete. Last little bit, two last little bits. Bucket number 3, which is a good bucket for the question, talks about cost-effective customer acquisition. That this notion of cost-effective, that has kind of come out of nowhere. Why does it have to be cost-effective? If it needs to be cost-effective, there might be something in the complication that needs to be introduced that tells us something like, I don't know, we're operating on a shoestring budget. We want to, something of that sort. But it's not a given that customer acquisition in the early stages should be cost effective. Yeah. Last thing, this is again about formulation. It's a comment very similar to what I had about the question, the question to solve. Instead of saying, I'll just take the first bucket, which customer segments offer the most valuable path? I would just say, make it much more action-oriented and put the week one as a protagonist. So which customer segments should week one target? Yeah, I think that's just much more to the point, action-oriented, and actually makes the wording shorter. So that's my feedback. Any questions, observations, comments from the people presently in attendance? Yet. Okay. All right, then let us move on. Okay, so we're still in phase 2 here, basically trying to build a roadmap for the problem that we have, defined very robustly, the project that we've defined very robustly that we want to deliver. Now, if you remember the IKEA wardrobe metaphor that I shared with you last time. Last time I shared with you the what. So what do we mean by a project roadmap? What does a good project roadmap look like? So the 3 conditions, right? What does a great roadmap wardrobe look like? And so now what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the how-to. How do we build that? How do we get there? And so I'm going to throw a lot at you. It's going to be a lot of content, a lot. Yeah. So don't be too surprised if some stuff goes in one ear and goes out the other. Especially at this time of day, you probably don't have that much space left. But one, you'll have the recording. That's one thing. And the slides. The second thing is all the techniques I'm going to share for your project, your final report. You're only going to be working on one big question on your final report, but I'm going to show techniques for different types of questions. So I would say, if you already know the kind of question you're going to work on, pay most attention when I'm talking about those kinds of questions, your kind of question, and you can afford to pay less attention when I'm talking about another kind of question. Okay, so with that said, so I'm going to share, like I said, I'm going to share with you techniques. Basically, in business, I think there's a few different types of questions. Maybe something I'm still working on, but maybe 5 or 6 different types of of questions in business. But some of them are extremely rare. I would say there's 3 types of questions that account for 99% of business questions. And so I'm going to show you techniques for those 3 kinds. The most common one are how-to questions, how to achieve a certain goal. So I'm going to share with you 5 techniques for that. And then there's a subset of the how-to questions, which are the how-to that are of a numerical nature. And for those, There's an extra set of techniques, so I'm going to share with you two additional techniques for those. Yeah. Then there's what's called the system questions. These are god awful. And I really hope that you're not working on one of those for your um, final report. And if you're trending towards that, you might consider shifting towards something else. I will show you what I have figured out about how to think about those, um, but it's pretty limited. And then there's the options questions, which are quite common as well. Uh, and the great news is that they're remarkably simple to think about, unbelievably simple. So that's a little bit, and then we'll of course do the validation conclusion. But so let me start. Let me start with the how-to. So first, let's be clear. What is a how-to question? A how-to question is a question that asks, how can we achieve a certain objective? How can we improve profit, right? I think the two questions that we had in the examples were how-to questions. How can we achieve whatever, 100K revenue by next year? And the other one was, how can we increase market share from 15 to 20% with this segment? So these were how-to questions. Now, I'm going to reuse this little trick that I used before, problem-solving trick around fast-forwarding to the end. It's very helpful, this trick. So imagine if you have a question like this and you fast-forward to the end and you say, all right, so what does the answer look like? And the answer to a how-to question is basically, well, to achieve the goal that you want to achieve, you should, you should do X, you should do Y, and you should do Z. That's your recommendation. Do X, do Y, do Z. Take action one, action two, action three. It might seem obvious, but this is not trivial at all because the 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 nature of the answer, the composition of the answer, the fact that it's based on actions means that we were going to want to think in terms of actions. And in particular, we're going to want to think in terms of change drivers or value drivers. These are fancy words for the types of actions that lead to the desired outcome. Okay? So I'm going to show you how we can do this in a minute. Let me just first say this. By far, the simplest, easiest, most effective way of breaking down a how-to question is with more how-to questions. I really don't recommend trying anything different. And the thing is, how is the only preposition that connects directly with the notion of action. What doesn't, where doesn't, who doesn't, but how, yes. So that's the beauty. Okay, so by the way, interrupt me if there's something I'm saying that's not clear or whatever, just interrupt me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 5 techniques for how-to questions. 4 of them are pretty like heavy, and 1 of them is really light. And the 4 heavy ones, I need to show them to you kind of at the same time. So I'm going to try to do it as gently as possible, but it's going to be heavy. But I think it's pretty cool. It's like really cool stuff. I just hope that at 6:30 p.m. you can still appreciate that kind of stuff. All right, so let's start with an example. Imagine the question is, how can Mars improve the taste of M&Ms? Yeah. So the idea here is, if we just imagine for a moment that this bottle is kind of our M&Ms, the idea with these 4 techniques is that like we're looking at the problem from a variety of different angles. So these 4 techniques I'm going to show you, I actually call them the 4 angles. Yeah, each angle gives you some kind of insight that the other angles can't, but it has, blindfolds. Every angle has its own blindfolds. Or blind spots. Imagine when you're driving, you always have blind spots. So one way that now remember the notion of dimension that we talked about, right? We want to break down a problem using a single dimension to avoid the Misi problem. So one way that we could think about this question of how to improve the taste of M&Ms is by using the dimension of ingredients. So in other words, what I'm doing is I'm taking my M&Ms, I'm breaking them down into ingredients, and I get something like this. How can Mars improve the taste of chocolate, of the peanuts, of the cocoa butter, of whatever else is in there? That's one way to look at this problem. This is called component thinking. Basically, because I've taken my M&M and I've broken it up into its components, which are ingredients. All right, second way of looking at the problem. The dimension here is going to be the M&M products. So, as you know, you can buy like the brown bag of M&Ms, you can buy the yellow bag of M&Ms, you can buy the blue bag of M&Ms. I think at Christmas you can buy a red bag of M&Ms. And so my example here is the actual example is a little bit messed up, but you'll get the point. So you can say like, hey, how can Mars improve the taste of the M&Ms in brown bags? How can they improve the taste of M&Ms in yellow bags, in blue bags, and so on and so forth? That's another way of looking at it. This is called segmentation thinking. I think you're all familiar with segmentation. Segmentation is something that is most common when we're talking about people and in particular marketing, but actually segmentation can be applied to objects as well, right? It's just to any kind of population. All right. Third way that we could look at this is we could look at it from the perspective of what are the drivers of taste, the things that contribute to the experience of taste. Now, I didn't know this from by myself, so I had to do a little bit of research. But what the research says is that there's four things that are relevant for M&Ms that contribute to the experience of taste. One is the flavor, which is different from taste. Flavor is a part of taste. Yeah. Second is the texture. Third is the aroma, so the smell. And fourth is the visual aspect. All these together combine to create the experience of taste. So that's another way to look at the problem. And this is called driver thinking, because each of these is kind of a driver, a cause that contributes to the taste as it is, or as we want it to be. The fourth way of looking at it is the fourth dimension would be the M&M manufacturing process. So the whole idea being, hey, if this M&M if I want it to be tastier, since this M&M is the result of some kind of process that gave rise to its existence, maybe if I improve the process, the M&M will be better. That's the idea. So then I can say, how can Mars improve the foundational cocoa chocolate paste? That's the first step in their process. Then the combining with the cocoa butter and the chocolate liquor, and finally the candy coating. Okay, their process is a bit more complicated, but you get my point. So this is called process thinking. So we have component thinking, segmentation thinking, driver thinking, process thinking. All of them offer a way of hacking at the problem. None of them is complete because none of them can be. There is no way that you can look at an object and have the full 360-degree view. You can't, unless you yourself move around. But at some point, you need to stop and say, this is the way I'm going to focus on it. If you want to take a picture, you cannot take a 360-degree picture of anything. So component thinking, segmentation, driver thinking, process thinking. None of them is better than the other in the absolute. It's just going to depend on the question and what you come up with in terms of the dimension. And yeah, in this case, if what we're looking at this here, one might argue maybe, I don't know, the ingredients perspective or the component thinking is better than another one, maybe. But again, we don't even have any context, so who knows? Okay, so just to put a little bit more structure to this, component segmentation drivers process. So The components and the segmentation, this is really about, it's really focusing on the what. So, on the M&M itself, like what is it that makes the M&M, etc. So we're breaking down the M&M or the population of M&Ms. But the drivers and the process, it's a different kind of thinking. This is more like the how this thing comes about. So it's more about causality thinking. Yeah? So these are the four angles. Let me show you one other example where we can see four angles, completely different examples, just to give you a bit of a sense. The slides have a total of 6 examples of this. I'm just going to run through one more. And then I'll pause and just see if you have any kind of questions. So let me take, I'm trying to figure out which one to take. I think I'm going to take this one. So the question is, how can a retailer increase the sales of televisions? Now, I think what's important is we need to go back to what we talked about last time. When we're faced with the how-to question, we need to isolate the core of the question because we break down the core. What I didn't say last time is that sometimes questions can have 2 cores or even 3 cores, which is great because it gives us more choice about which part of the question we break down. This question, how can retailer increase sales of televisions, has 2 cores. One is basically increasing sales. So we can really focus on thinking about how do we increase sales? And the other one is televisions. We can really focus on sort of somehow breaking down televisions and trying to get more insights into how we can increase the sales of televisions. Yeah. So with that in mind, let me start with component. So component, I could apply it to televisions, but it doesn't really make sense because we're not going to start selling the screen separately from the power cord, separately from the remote control, etc. So breaking it up by component doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But sales, I could certainly break it up into the components of sales. And there's different ways of thinking about the different components of sales, but like a common one would be sales channel, right? If you just think there's sales in total, if you break it up, if you look in an annual report, okay, there could be like a geographic bit, but a common one is by type of channel. So we could break it up like this. How can a retailer increase sales of televisions? Increase in-store sales of televisions, web store sales, so its own web store, and then sales through other online channels like Amazon and whatever, other kinds of things like that. That's one way we could look at the problem. Segmentation. Now, segmentation, I could apply that thinking to televisions, right? For example, I could segment my TVs by size. I could also segment them by technology or maybe by some other measure. Depends what you think is relevant. But I think size could be an interesting one. So by size, so then I could say, how can the retailer increase sales of small TVs, medium-sized TVs, large TVs? All right. Drivers. So we're now talking about, so drivers of televisions that I'm not even sure that the concept makes a whole lot of sense. Maybe, but not as it immediately jumps to mind. But the drivers of sales, yes. In fact, I think that the most obvious drivers of sales that comes to my mind is the 4 Ps of marketing, the marketing mix, right? Price, place, product promotion, etc. Are the factors that explain the success or non-success of sales of a product or a service. So I think that's a nice way to think about it. So we can take the marketing 4 Ps. You could even make it the 7 Ps if you think that's relevant. But so how can we improve the portfolio of TVs on offer? That's the product. It's a translation of product for a retailer. The pricing of the TVs, the promotion of the TVs, and then sufficient availability of TVs. That's the translation of place for a retailer. Yeah? For a retailer who already has its stores in a fixed place. So anyway, that could be another way we look at it. And then the process. So we could think about the process that leads to sales, yeah. The process of televisions, we could think about manufacturing of televisions, but again, I'm not sure that improving the manufacturing process of TVs will result in more sales for the retailer. But here's one thing. Sometimes the way we frame a question, we leave out things that are obvious, so we leave them implicit. But if we make it explicit, what we might get is, how can the retailer increase the sales of televisions to buyers? It sounds obvious, but when we make this explicit, now it's actually easier to apply process thinking because we can think about the buyer journey, the journey that the buyer goes through, like, the journey in here that they go through, that and that ends with them making a payment. So it could look like this. How could the retailer maximize customer awareness? How could they maximize customer interest and desire or activation? How can they maximize conversion of this desire into buying intent? And then how can they maximize the conversion of intent into purchase? Right? So it basically kind of created the steps that a potential buyer goes through, and then how do we maximize, the volume in the first step, and then the conversion to the next step, to the next step, to the next step. Voila. 4 different ways of looking at the problem, 4 different angles for how to look at the problem. Any questions about that? Reactions? Yeah, Oli?
No question. Everything is clear.
Okay. All right. So like I said, there's like 4 other slides with different examples of this. What I've also done is, for all the examples, I've then kind of like restructured the slide. I'll just show you one example of the slide, but I've taken, for 4 examples, I'm just showing you side by side component thinking for 4 different questions, then side by side segmentation thinking for 4 different questions, et cetera, et cetera. So this way you can sort of like drill down into a type of thinking by looking at multiple examples, and then you can also just look at one question and sort of dance around the question by looking at the 4 different angles for that question. Yeah, so you can just train your brain in different ways with the slides. And since I'm here, I will explain now this drivers of behavior that I mentioned for the appendix. So driver thinking is basically, right, the causes that lead to this outcome, right? You can see in the little picture here, the drivers that lead to the desired outcome. A lot of business problems can be framed in terms of problems about how to change people's behavior in a way that benefits us. The most classic case is actually how to change customer behavior so that they buy more. Yeah. And so when you frame the problem like that, you can look at it in terms of what are the drivers of people's behavior. And in the appendix, you'll see basically the basic thinking, how to think about that is actually remarkably simple and elegant. And then there is a nice framework that captures some more of the nuances that are not so obvious from the very basic thinking around it. So voila, that's what's in the appendix. Okay, so these were the four techniques that kind of come together, the four angles, but I told you there were five, so I'm going to show you the fifth one now. It is much lighter than these four, and it's called opposite words. The idea is that you break down your word, your core, into two bits that have a bit of a yin yang type relationship, where somehow it feels like they're a little bit opposite, but they go together. Jekyll and Hyde or whatever, right? So it can be like supply demand, internal, external, financial, non-financial, those kinds of things. So if we go back to how can a retailer increase the sales of televisions, and I focus on increasing sales, we could break it down into how can we increase sales through marketing actions and through non-marketing actions. Nothing super insightful, but it can be useful if you're feel like you're getting really stuck somewhere. Yeah. So, or if you want to, for a part of your question tree that you don't think matters all that much. Okay, so let me just wrap up this bit about how to with one last thing, which is that when you do a full breakdown, you actually break down more than one question. You break down the main question, but then you also break down all the questions that are on level one. And so each of these questions that you break down in level one is you can actually use one of the four angles. So in the end, you're doing a lot of breakdowns in order to do one big breakdown, if that makes sense. And with every question that you break down, like whether it's a level 0 question or level 1 question, there's an opportunity to use another one of those four angles or opposite words. So I'll show you how it could end up being kind of a combination of things. So if the question is, how can we improve the quality of university recruits? And I focus, right? So here I have two choice words, quality and university recruits, but I'm going to focus on university recruits. What I could do is first apply process thinking, and in particular, like the journey of the recruit. So if you think about what a recruit does, they apply, so they knock on the door and they say, hey, could you let me in? Second step, they get evaluated. And third step, they join. It's a simple version, but so we could break it down like this. How can we improve the quality of applicants? So people who are saying, hey, can we join? Can we improve our selection method? This is when we evaluate them. And can we improve the new recruits before they start to work? So between the moment that they get the offer and the moment that they join, for example. Yeah. So that's a process. Now, when we go to applicants, how to improve quality of applicants? If I focus on applicants, I could use segmentation. There's a million ways I could segment them, but here's one. How could we recruit the quality of applicants from schools where we already recruit and by recruiting at new schools? Now, the selection method, I'm going to use the components of the method. So a typical selection method consists of what? A process that the candidate goes through. There's a process. There are criteria that they are evaluated against, and there are people who do the evaluation. All these are the components of the whole selection method. So how can we improve our process? How can we improve this method by adjusting our criteria and by improving our recruiters? And lastly, how can we improve the new recruits before they start to work? What I could do is use opposite words. For example, by training them before their start date and training them right after their start date, but before they actually start work in their job. So, during a week, for example, when they're still getting their laptop and stuff like this. So what you get here is, what you see is in this breakdown, there were several techniques used: process, segmentation, components, opposite words. And so that was kind of the point, is that like a full breakdown could include multiple techniques that are used, but there's only one technique per actual question that is broken down. Because here there's 4 questions that are broken down. The question level 0, the one at level 0, and the 3 at level 1. Let me pause again to ask any questions about this.
Yeah, what is the best practice? Do you have to ask for every kind of topic of these 4 or 5 elements, or is it enough to go just for components and segmentation, for example?
You mean the best practice in terms of selecting between one of the 4 angles?
Yeah, do I have to focus on one? Shall I take all angles, or if it's mandatory to take all?
Well, no, there's nothing there's nothing mandatory. So what I think in general is very good is, I think it's very good if you're confronted with a question. So here, let's go back to something that we did before. Where is that? The TV thing. There we go. So if you're confronted with a question like how can we increase the sales of televisions, right? I think it's really good if you're able to come up with a couple of different perspectives. 2, 3, 4 is even better, assuming, I'm going to ignore constraints of time and all this kind of stuff right now. I'm just kind of in my bubble, But the more perspectives you have on how to tackle this problem, like if you have 2 perspectives, already you can have a debate with yourself and maybe even with your sponsor, a discussion around, hey, do you think it makes more sense to look at it, like through the channels, the sales channel, or the TV size? And that's probably going to depend a lot on what do you believe is going on with the problem of sales. If you believe that, like, yeah, it's whatever. If you believe that, like, you have a channel problem, then probably the channel perspective is a more useful one, right? But I think having different perspectives helps you can facilitate a helpful conversation where you can ultimately sort of converge towards a way that actually seems more appropriate for this question in this context right now. If you only have one perspective, you can't have alternatives. Now, if you have 4 perspectives, you can have an even richer conversation, richer consideration of options. So that's what I would recommend, is just try to think of different ways of looking at the problem.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think you need to build the full question tree for each angle to make a decision, to compare them. I think level 1, right? So what I'm showing here is just level 1, the level 1 breakdown. But just doing a level 1 breakdown, 2 or 3 different level 1 breakdowns, and then putting them side by side and just being like, what feels right given what I know about this problem, the context, and so on and so forth? What feels more right?
Okay, so if I summarize, it would be not a good idea to just start with one dimension. So give a first try for all and then select if it's worth to keep all 4 of them or just narrow it down to the important ones.
Well, you won't be able to, you can't keep all 4. Because at the end of the day, once you need to select one, and then you need to go. So here, the university student. There we go, university recruit. At level 1, I have 4 choices, right? You can see I have my component choice, which is how to recruit like smarter, more experienced people. I have my segmentation, which is like, where should I recruit them? I have my driver's choice, which is like, what kind of background, basically, right? And then I have my process one, which is the quality of applicants, etc. So I have 4 choices here. Now, in the end, in order to build my full question tree, I need to choose one. And here I've chosen one. Whoops. this one, where I'm focused on the process. And now I go deeper. And of course, I might use additional angles for the deeper questions. But for the level 0 questions, or kind of like your original problem, at the end of the day, you need to select one angle of attack. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but then where I have to work on this when I only focus on one way in the end.
Say that again?
Yeah, when I pick in the end only one and focus on this
Yeah.
solution, why do I have to put efforts and work in the other ones?
Just to give you, again, in order to make a better decision about which one to focus on. I don't know if I were to use I'm trying to use a different metaphor. Okay, so let's say you're considering to buy a bicycle for your commuting. Okay, and so you can either decide like, okay, so you go to a store and not, you enter in like the first, what's most visible is kind of like the city bikes. So you're like, okay, let's see which bike do I buy, and then you might compare different bikes, etc. But the thing is, there are other options besides city bikes. You could consider a mountain bike. You could consider a sort of racing type bike. You could consider a folding bike, or even a folding electric bike. I don't know. There's different types of bikes. So before deep diving into the options within each type of bike, you might decide to consider what are the pros and cons of a folding bike versus a city bike versus a mountain bike for my commuting purposes. Does that make sense? And then you might be like, okay, I think given, that I live in the countryside, blah, 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 I'm going to go for a mountain bike. So now let's see what the options are within that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I hope that helps. Good. Okay. All right. So that was the how-to questions in general. When the how-to questions are quantitative, meaning they're about a number, they're about making a number better. So it's usually either smaller or better or bigger. Which was, by the way, the case in the two examples that we saw earlier, where I gave feedback, right? Because one of it was about gaining share, etc. Then you can, let's say this opens up additional techniques because it basically opens up mathematical techniques. You can treat the problem as a math problem. You still need to use your business judgment, but you can treat the problem as a math problem. So I'm going to share with you two techniques. One is the base technique. It's kind of like the fundamental technique. And the other one is a special case of the base technique, which is extremely powerful, harder to execute, but extremely powerful. So let me start with the base technique. It's called a value driver tree. If you're not familiar with that, it's something that is extremely common and popular in the world of consulting, private equity, venture capital, investment banking, equity research. So pretty much any of these professions where people actually care a lot about values and like very practical things that they can do to improve the value of something. So I'm going to show you through an example. So let's say that we want to increase the profitability of our fitness app. So, okay, this one is easy to get started. Profit is revenue and cost. So we can increase revenues, reduce cost. I'm putting a minus sign just to make it explicit that we're doing this mathematically. All right, so increase revenues. I could do this by increasing the number of users times the revenue per user. The number of users, I can increase this by increasing the number of people with our app installed times the percent of people who use it. Number of people with our app installed is the number of people with any app installed times the percent of those that have our app, and so on and so on and so forth. And so what you get here is, in this example, we have 11 boxes on the right. Actually 12, because there's also the percent that have used the app. So there's 12 sort of like that, sort of like endpoint boxes. And if I change any one of those, the value of any one of those, and hold all the rest constant, then it'll change the value of the box that precedes it and the box that precedes it, and it'll make its way all the way to the profitability. Right? So it's pretty cool that way. Some of these endpoint boxes are things that you can influence. Some of these you can't, but at least you can monitor them if you're like a CFO. And the beauty about this is that as long as the math works, which basically means you have kept track of your units and you have not made a mistake with the units, as long as the math works, it's going to be MECE. So basically, it's going to be logically ultra robust. Yeah. Basically, because math is just a very specific form of logic. So that's why. Yeah. So this is what a value driver tree is. In fact, the help desk example that I've used many times was a value driver tree the whole time. I just never showed you the signs, but here they are. And this is one of the reasons that it works. Yeah. Now, if you look at this sign, so that was the base method, right? The value driver tree. I'm now going to show you the special case of that method, of that technique. But for this, we need to look at the signs here. So as you can see, there's plus and minus here, which are basically like they're equivalents of each other, brother and sister. And then you have multiplication and division, which are equivalents of each other, but they're more like cousins with a plus minus, yeah? So when we build a question tree with multiplication and division, that's called factoring, and it's incredibly powerful, incredibly powerful. So I'll show you an example and how to do it, and hopefully you will also see why it's so powerful. In essence, it's extremely efficient, and you get insights so quickly. So the example will be the following. We're going to work on, let's say that we want to decrease the labor costs in our call center. Yeah, so the help desk call center. So this is an inbound call center where people call in. We don't call out, but people call in, right? When they have an issue. So how do we do this? What we want to do is you want to think of some kind of a value driver, quantitative, that directly impacts the labor costs. And we're going to call this X. And we're going to multiply or divide by X over X, which is basically multiplying or dividing by 1. So we're not changing any values. But we're then going to rearrange. Let me just do it the first time already. You'll get the sense. So if we think what is something that impacts the labor costs in the call center, like a direct driver of labor costs, you could say is the number of hours that are worked in that call center. The more hours people work, the more we have to pay them. The less hours they work, the less we have to pay them. So, number of hours. So what we have here, the labor cost is equal to the hours times the labor cost divided by hour. I think you can follow the math. right? So it basically becomes how can we decrease hours and how can we decrease the labor cost per hour? Now, labor cost per hour is basically the wage rate, right? So you see, we introduce one concept, hours, like a relevant concept, how much we work in the call center, and it sort of forced out another concept, which is the wage rate. So now we have two big drivers of this labor cost. Now we can go further. How to decrease the hours. So a direct driver of hours is how many calls we get. The more calls we get, the more we have to work, and vice versa. So how to increase the number of calls, time, and then decrease hours per call, which is basically the call duration, is how much time we stay on the phone with each call. Another interesting sort of insight or concept. And then the number of calls, what drives that? Probably the number of clients that we have. So how to decrease the number of clients and how to decrease calls per client. Now, maybe you're thinking, wait, hold on. Decreasing number of clients, that doesn't feel like a good thing to do. And that's totally right. From a business perspective, it's not a good thing to do. But from a mathematical perspective or a logical perspective, if we decrease the number of clients, it will decrease the costs in the labor in the call center. There is that relationship. That's factually correct. It's just that it's a relationship. We don't want to activate this relationship because we just don't want to decrease the number of clients. So fine. So we're then going to say we don't touch the number of clients, but we can still work on the rest. How to decrease the calls per client, how to decrease the hours per call, and how to decrease the labor cost per hour. So basically decrease call frequency, call duration, and wage rate. So with this simple exercise, we've basically popped out a whole bunch of very relevant, impactful concepts that were buried in the notion of labor costs, but we've now extracted them. So that's I think what's very cool about this approach. Any questions about this?
No, this makes sense.
Okay. All right. Now let me share with you the one I really don't like. This one is, I don't like it at all, but I have to do it for the sake of completeness. So system questions. First, let's define what they are. So system questions, they're also how-to questions. But the thing is, unlike the other how-to questions that simply say, how can I achieve this goal? These ones say, no, it's fine. How can we achieve our goal via a specific system or model or framework? Right? So I don't know. How can we, I don't know, gain whatever, achieve 10% market share by adapting or changing our business model? Right? I'm requiring that the answer be about a business model. That's what's happening. So, what makes these things difficult, these kinds of questions, is that it requires you to actually to have knowledge. It requires you to have knowledge about the process of designing these kinds of frameworks. A business model, an operating model, an organizational model, something or other. Now, business model is actually, it's quite simple, the process of designing a business model. And I actually know how to do that, so I will show you. But things like designing an operating model and designing an organizational model or some other kind of model. I mean, there's a lot of models for which there isn't really a pathway to do that. There just isn't. And so the people who actually know how to do this is because, I don't know, they've done it a million times. They've learned about all the things that don't work, and then they've learned that some things work in some contexts and other things work in other contexts. So there's a lot of trial and error, but there is no set path, especially for things like operating models and org models. So this is what makes these things really tough. But anyway, let me just share the thing about operating models. Let me start with an example. No, not operating model, sorry, business model. And let me start with an example. So let's say that Philips designed a whole new home espresso machine. It's very cool, makes amazing coffee, but it's also extremely expensive to produce. And so if you just kind of take the approach of like, this is how much it costs us to produce, we add a margin of whatever, 10, 15%, and that's the price, it's never going to sell. Nobody will ever buy this thing because it's way too expensive for a home. So the question is, what business model should they use for this machine? So what we're going to do is we're going to use the business model canvas. There's a nice canvas for this. So here's the canvas. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the business model canvas. It basically it's something that describes various aspects of the business that you're trying to build in a way that like all these aspects work together in a coherent manner so that you have a coherent business that is profitable and in a sustainable way. That's the idea. All the parts need to work together. But how to build this, how to design this, there's a sequence that you need to follow. And the very first thing that you need to solve is actually two things at the same time. Who do you want to target and what value proposition do you want to make to them? So in other words, what promise do you want to make to whom? That's the first thing you need to solve. That's the core. In fact, that becomes the object. It's the whole purpose of this business model is to be able to deliver this value proposition to these people, this segment, to these segments. Once we figure this out, then we can move on to the next bit, which is what are the channels we want to use to interact with our customers? When we acquire them, how to keep them, how to nurture them, and how to grow revenue from them. So it's sorry, that's not the channels. That's more like what are the mechanisms that we want to use to acquire them, to keep them, and to grow revenue from them. The mechanisms. Once we figure that out, then we can think what are the channels that we want to use to interact with them and essentially do the things that we want to do with them. Once that's figured out, then we can be like, okay, so how do we want to structure our business relationship with them? So in other words, how do we want to earn money from them? What do we want them to actually pay for? In what ways? Subscription, whatever, you know all the different pricing mechanisms, right? And eventually the rest. So there's a sequence. So when we're trying to structure the question, it's about following that sequence. What should be our target customer segment? What value proposition do we offer them? How should we architect the customer relationships? And how do we do the rest? And so I don't know if you noticed, but there's a big difference between how we structured this and the others. The others, we were using what's called a grouping system. So we have this branch, this branch, this branch, and all these branches we could, in a sense, do in parallel. They worked. It was kind of an and between them. But with this business model, or more generally these system questions, you often need to use a chain logic. the elements depend on how you solve element 2 depends on how you solve element 1. And that makes already things a lot more difficult. And there's a lot less room for mistake. Because if I don't solve, for example, here, if I get my value proposition wrong, then everything that follows is going to be designed for the wrong value proposition. So my whole business model will be messed up. So that's a little bit what's harder about these system questions. That's one of the things that's harder. The other thing, as I said, is that for some models that we want to build, there's no preset sequence. So overall, I think this is a very, very difficult kind of problem solving. And I think for something like a final report, I mean, this is my personal opinion, but I recommend to stay away from problems like that. I think the final report is challenging in plenty of other ways that you don't need to further add to your challenge by having to solve a problem which is itself incredibly difficult. So that's my recommendation. Good. Now, let me move on to much easier questions. Much, 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 much easier. So the options questions. These are, I mean, when you're tired, the options questions are kind of a delight because they're like, pooh, so relaxing. So first, let's be clear what they are. So options questions are basically questions that ask you to decide between options. And option questions come in 3 different varieties, 3 levels of complexity. But the good news is it doesn't matter the level of complexity of the question. How we think about them is going to be exactly the same. But still, let's be clear what the 3 levels of complexity are. This way, it's easier to recognize what an options question is. So the simplest basic level is a should we, yes or no question, should we question. So the question, should we enter Poland? Okay. Next level is choosing one option amongst several, amongst 2 or more. So should we enter Poland, Czech, or Hungary? By the way, I should clarify, this is from a commercial perspective, not from a geopolitical or military perspective. This is purely commercial. Yeah. And then the third level of question is choosing a few out of an even bigger set. So which 5 EU countries should we enter? Okay. Now, you can, I think, appreciate that the question there's more moving parts in each question, but actually how we think about them is exactly the same. So if I do the same mental exercise I did before, which is I'm going to imagine what an answer looks like, it's going to be something like this. Well, you should do X or whatever. You should enter Poland or you should enter UK or France and Germany or whatever because of these reasons. Reason 1, reason 2, reason 3, reason 4. Remember before in the how-to, the logic was to achieve your goal, you should take action 1, action 2, action 3. So now the whole logic has changed away from actions to reasons. It's totally different. And the reasons that we use to justify a certain action emanate from the criteria that we have that govern our thinking. Criteria, you could say, is what reflects It's a reflection of our values, of our preferences, what we find important. That's it. So the reasons reflect what we find important. So we want to think in terms of decision criteria. Here's an example of a yes or no question that we already looked at. Should Apple build an iCar? And as you can see in this structure, this breakdown, every question reflects some kind of a criterion that we attach importance to. Yeah. Now, imagine that we're looking at these three questions. Should Emirates buy Etihad Airways? Should my cousin do an MBA? Should Toyota build a plant in Rwanda to increase sales in Africa? So I'm going to show you. We're not going to go through all the details, but in short, right? Should Emirates buy Etihad? You would think, well, on one level, actually, I think it's almost too detailed here, but on one level, you'd be thinking like, okay, can they make good money out of this? Second, is that good for their strategy? Like, will it help them to, bring them closer to their strategic goals, whatever their strategic goals may be, right? So I don't know. One of them could be it gives them pricing power in the region. Okay. Another one could be it gives them sort of like access to new kinds of customers that had poor access to, for example, in Abu Dhabi, because there's synergies, whatever. Third, is it even like how difficult is it for them to pull this off? Is it even feasible? Do they have the money, for example, to acquire Etihad? Will they be able to get regulatory approval? And so on. Fourth, the risks. Can they manage the risks associated with this acquisition? With in any kind of acquisition where there's a lot of I don't know what to call them, but like non-management workers involved who can often be unionized, but even if they're not unionized, you have a lot of personnel risks associated with acquisitions like that. And then are there better alternatives? Maybe, I don't know, Oman Air is like an easier thing to do. So there's these criteria. Now, what I'm going to posit to you is that when we think about your cousin doing an MBA, we're going to be thinking about the same questions. Again, you're going to be thinking, is it an attractive ROI for the cousin? Strategically, is that a good idea? Will it help his career or her career? It's not the same thing. It's not the same strategic considerations as Emirates purchasing Etihad, but the strategic bucket is the same. Again, there's a question of feasibility, how difficult it is to pull this off. Can they get admission? Can they get financing, etc. Then there's a question potentially about managing the risks. There might be risks of not obtaining the desired job. There might be a risk of not being able to return to the current job. There might be some relationship risks, like family, if you're displacing your family or not displacing them and leaving them behind or whatever, right? So, and again, you would consider the alternatives. And same thing for Toyota in building their plant in Rwanda. So the point, what I'm saying is that actually, when we're thinking, when we're invoking our criteria to try to evaluate like an option, we all use the same criteria, the same buckets of criteria. And it's the same five big buckets in business, huh? Basically, there's something about economic benefit. There's something about the additional benefits beyond money, the qualitative benefits, or we can call them the strategic benefits. There's something about the feasibility, the difficulty of doing this, something about the potential downsides, the risks, and how manageable those are, and something about the alternatives or the opportunity cost of doing this. And that's how elegant it is. That's how simple it is. It's quite beautiful that way. Um, so that's very nice. And then, so that was for the yes or no questions. If I make the question more complex, so I give more options, for example, like this, right? Should my cousin do an MBA, an MBA, or simply continue to work or whatever? Then basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to evaluate each of the options against the same sets of criteria. But this time I don't even have to use criteria number 5, which is the alternatives, because the alternatives are already in the question. So it becomes even simpler. Just criteria 1 through 4. That's simple. So now there's a different way to look at there's a different, let's say, angle from which you can look at the criteria question. A different way to slice the criteria, which I'm going to share with you. And I think this different way is especially useful for product questions. And the whole premise here is that a product question, so a successful product, in the long term is a product that continuously, reliably solves the needs of a certain segment of customers, or maybe even multiple segments of customers. But it solves the needs of customers. That's what a great product is. If it doesn't, it'll make money for a little while and then, yeah. So, given that the customer is so central to the success of a product, and the customer is basically, it's a stakeholder in the game of business, we can restructure our whole look at a question about a product from the perspective of the stakeholders that are connected to this product, starting with the customer. And there's a nice little, I don't know, it's not, people call it a framework, but it's actually not a framework. But the 3 C's, which you might be familiar with. Um, so customer, competition or competitors, and company. So you start with that because anytime you look at a product problem, you should be thinking about the customer. And if you're going to start doing that, then might as well also look at the competition and the company. And then add any other stakeholders that might be relevant for this particular problem. Could be regulators, it could be channels, it could be, I don't know, some other form of government, whatever. Maybe none. Suppliers, maybe, but just any other relevant. And then frame from each stakeholder, figure out what is the criteria that is relevant, not to them, but to us, but that connects to that stakeholder. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that we have a company that is in the drinks business, and they want to enter a market that's new for them, which is sports drinks. Now, but they want to do it in a different way than the way that existing players do it. So a typical sports drink does 2 things. It replenishes electrolytes, that's its main function, but it also includes sugar, in part because the sugar gives an initial boost, but also sugar is tasty and is sweet and therefore tasty. But this company that we're talking to, they're thinking about entering the market with a sports drink that replenishes electrolytes, but without sugar, because sugar is unhealthy and there's a big anti-sugar craze, etc. Of course, it's not a trivial question whether they should do it. So the question is, should they launch this electrolyte problem? And so now what we're going to do is we're going to try to frame this in terms of the criteria that are at stake here, but from the perspective of stakeholders. So we're going to start with the customer, because that's always the most important. And then we could just basically say, and remember, we want to frame this again in the form of questions, questions that give us useful answers. So the question with customers might be something along the lines of, do we think enough of them will want to buy this product? It's another way of saying, is there a big enough market for this, for our product or whatever, or can we sell enough? But since we're starting explicitly with the notion of customer, we're going to say, will enough of them want to buy it? Then we move on to competitors. Can we outcompete them? It's another criterion for us. Then we move to company. Can we operate profitably? So can we do all this and still make money? And then it's like, okay, do we need to add anybody else? And well, in fast-moving consumer goods, as I think as you probably know, right? We don't buy our drinks directly from the manufacturers. We buy them at stores, retailers, etc. So these are the channels. So the channels play a key role here. And the question is, will they be willing and able to carry this new product for us? So will we be able to, can we sell this product through our existing channels? And there we go. And that's kind of like, it's another way, it's another criteria-based way of hacking at the question of should we launch this product? And what's nice about it is that like it puts the customer at the center. That's the very nice thing about it. Downsides, things like risk are buried deeper into the structure. They don't come to the front right away. So, or we need to move them to the front. But anyway, that's just another take on the whole criterion perspective. Voilà. Last thing I'm going to say. It is the age of AI. And I think we need to talk about how to use AI in problem solving, and in particular in problem structuring. So I will give you my take. And my take is actually very much inspired by two things. One is by two guiding principles. I think one is we want to be efficient and pragmatic because we're busy. We're all busy. We have lots of things to do, lots of things on our agenda, etc. So we want to be busy. We want to be, pragmatic and not reinvent the wheel from scratch completely by ourselves every time. At the same time, so the other value is that our brain is the most valuable thing that we have. And the muscle, our brain is a muscle that like in order to keep it going, we need to nurture it, meaning we need to keep it working. That's how it stays strong and maybe even in fact becomes stronger. And so we want to be thinking about our problems and not outsourcing the thinking of problems to people, including AI. So my recommended approach is here is first build your question tree by yourself. Do yourself that favor. Use your brain, train your brain, use your muscles. Then ask an expert. So there's all sorts of experts, but like the easiest expert nowadays is AI, because AI is, you don't need to make an appointment. It gives you an answer right away. It's free. It's great. So ask ChatGPT or whoever, Claude, right? How would you think about this problem? Then use your critical reasoning to sort of clean up what ChatGPT gives you. It could make mistakes sometimes, so there's two things that I've seen. One is it will sometimes give a couple of extra things that I hadn't thought about, but that actually do not apply in the very specific context that we have. Second, so that's not an error. That's just they don't necessarily have enough context. And the other thing I've noticed is sometimes AI makes mistakes along the lines of, even though AI knows the MECE concept, it isn't always MECE. Sometimes AI creates overlaps, sometimes bad ones. So you need to tell it, hey, yo, AI, like boop, overlaps, etc. Yeah. So clean up the answer from AI, then compare your question tree with what AI gave you, and then learn from that, get insight from that. And I think this is and then refine your question tree, of course. And I think this is at least that's how I think you can be pragmatic, but at the same time, still adhere to the notion that like, I want to do the thinking by myself. Like I want to do the original thinking. I want to train my brain, etc., and not just outsource it to some third party and actually not be able to defend what it's come up with. Okay, so some tips on so first other sort of techniques. I think when you're building a tree, I think build one level at a time. So build, your level one, and then you can build out to the next question, whatever, the first question in level one down to level two and so on. But don't build horizontally, build vertically. And this we talked about, but I really suggest build two or three different trees, like down to level one or two, because it gives you the option, the possibility to compare before choosing this way and fully detailing it out. When you speak with clients, I think you always again want to be in the driving seat. So you draft a question tree, you get their feedback, etc. You don't want to be asking them, your sponsor, to come up with a tree or to build a tree together. I think that's a bit too much, but it's best if they react to a tree that you built. And how to run the conversation, because a tree there is so dense, there's so much on it, like intellectually. I think it's best by showing them level one. You could even hide with a piece of paper, like just hide level two and just discuss level one and just make sure they understand and see, are they on the same page or do they already have feedback on level one? And do that before you start to show levels two and three. Because if you show them the whole thing, the risk is that, especially if they are people who are like detail oriented as opposed to big picture people, the risk is that they immediately go to the detail and start giving you feedback on the detail. And that's not the conversation you want to have if you haven't settled on the big picture first. Compare alternatives with clients or sponsor. I think it's great if they can also, together with you, look at two different question trees and just be like, oh yeah, two different ways of looking at the problem and discuss together which one might be a better fit. Of course, ask insightful questions and remember to play back and summarize as part of that discussion. So, how do you know that you are done with this phase? I think you have a complete question tree down to level two and three. Your question tree fully passes the health check. So the three conditions we talked about, right? So solution focus, MECE, and fits the case, the context. And your key stakeholders have explicitly validated it. Then you can be quite confident that you have a really robust, really good way of hacking at your problem. The warning signs at this stage, to be buried in research, like you don't want to be, like research at this stage is not what you want to do. It's not your friend. Trying to build a question tree, but when your question itself is too vague, that's very difficult to do. You need to, because you're building on top of the questions, and the question needs to be really sturdy, really specific. Or actually, your tree doesn't have questions, so it's a tree but not with questions. Or lastly, that your tree has data mining questions as opposed to solution focused questions. That's just creating a lot of work for yourself down the line. So next steps. My suggestion, refine your PDT and question trees, get feedback from each other, get feedback from sponsor. And then the next webinar will be entirely dedicated to giving feedback on question trees. So before, if you want to get feedback on it, please submit before the 4th of June. Your optional assignment number 4, submit a full question tree. So max level 3, please don't go further. Please apply the health check before submitting. Include an SCQ in your submission to provide me with context, and put it all on a single page, please, and keep it in PPT, not PDF. This way, if I need to move things around, it's just easier. I have more flexibility to make it, format friendly for these webinars. And then on the 9th of June is when we'll have the webinar. And so I will give the feedback on that. If we have time, I might share a couple of additional thinking tricks, but they're not on the level of the techniques I've given you. They're just kind of like ways of thinking. Maybe you find them useful, but that's pretty much what is in store and what I had for you today. Any questions?
Not from my side. Thank you, Nicola.
All right. Good. Then let me wish you a very nice evening to everybody. Happy problem solving. Good luck with your projects. And maybe I see a few of you at the next webinar.
Yeah. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.
Bye.